So welcome to our third webinar about the European HTA regulation. It's about the JCA in practice, from procedure to evidence generation. And we had two previous webinars. This is the third one. And these recordings are still available, by the way. But today, for some general information, today we're going to be really going more into details into the JCA. I'm excited. I hope you are as well. Yes, Sigrid, maybe you can start
Yes,
introducing
yes,
yourself quickly.
thank you. Well, I'm an oncologist by training, and I spent many years in the European regulatory system as a clinical assessor, and also several years in the Swedish HTA agency, where I worked on national reimbursement applications as well as multinational joint clinical assessment, and also on this regulation before it was adopted and afterwards. And what about you, Chantal?
Yes, I think my name is Chantal for Gils. And although I'm deep by training as well, my background has been really more on the other side. I've been in research as well as in companies and consultancy, doing a lot of HTA, market access, including reimbursement applications for many countries or global files. So I'm more on the dossier development side. And together we're going to present our key insights with you today. So let's move to the agenda first. And we have basically two parts. First, we will really provide you with some more details around the JCA procedure, timelines, procedural aspects, but also dossier content requirements, which is quite relevant to understand what needs to be there. And then we move to the piece with more around evidence. What evidence should you be collecting to go in the JCA? And we are also having a real world PICO example to give you some more to make it more tangible, basically, what a PICO is and what we mean by that and how you collect evidence. And we have two sessions for Q&A and discussion on practical implications, one after procedure, and then another one with evidence around the evidence session. And what we would like to do is to invite you to put your questions as they come in the chat. Please don't use the Q&A directly in the chat. We will be looking at the chat as we will then try to address your questions as we move on the presentation or in the discussion sessions.
Great. But first, we would like to start with a little recap for those of you who might not have heard so much about the regulation before. So the regulation is really about a mandatory HTA evaluation that will occur at the EU level. And this is called the joint clinical assessment. And there's also a supporting procedure called joint scientific consultation, which is an advice procedure. So this is what it's basically all about. So why is this important? Well, firstly, as I said, it's mandatory, and it runs in parallel with the marketing authorization procedure. So you really have to be prepared for both at the same time, not in a staggered fashion like it could be done earlier. Furthermore, here the dossier requirements are set and given to you by the HTA assessors. So all the analyses, the comparators, endpoints will be decided by the assessors, unlike the regulatory type of procedure where the company decides what to send in, and then the assessor look at that evidence. Furthermore, it's of course good to know that the whole intention of this regulation is to speed up market access in the EU. So that's really good for both patients and companies, of course. So when does this happen? Well, actually, now we're in January 2025, and it already applies to new cancer medicines and advanced therapies that seek approval in the EU. And then later on, orphan drugs will be added to the scope, and by 2030, all new medicines that go through the centralized procedure, as well as all new indication variations that come for drugs that previously had a JCA, will then again have to do with a new JCA procedure. So that's just a brief recap on that. And
I will also recap a bit on the PICO concept. I mean, the PICO is at the heart of the JCA. It's determining the scope. It's describing the analysis that need to be done, and the PICO framework, which is quite familiar in the HTA world for quite a while already, but it's really to set the scope for relative effectiveness, and the P stands for population, I for intervention. That is basically your drug under development or medical device. C is for the comparisons, the relevant comparators, the current therapies that are out there, the standard of care for your population, and the outcomes are the outcomes that are relevant. That's the O. So PICO, that's what we will be talking quite a bit about today.
yes, indeed. So now let's dive into the procedure, and we will start with the timeline. And I will walk you through this in quite detail. And as you can see, we have different colors here, where the dark blue is what the company needs to do. The light blue is what the HTA assessors do. And then we will also add in green the regulatory activities that are connected to this timeline. So it all starts here when you submit your marketing authorization application to the EMA. And on the same day, you are also required to submit to the HTA Secretariat what is referred to as relevant information. And this is basically the product information and the clinical overview from the regulatory dossier. So then, as soon as EMA has validated the application, that is when the JCA starts. And then the HTA assessors will discuss with the other member states what comparators they need or populations and endpoints that they use for their national HTA assessment. And then they will agree on a suitable PICO scope that can exist of several different PICOs. And they will then request this from the company. And this will happen no later than 10 days after the first list of questions in the regulatory procedure that is ongoing in parallel. But it's important to note that these are two completely different procedures. They are not connected in other parts than time-wise. So then the company knows what to do, what's expected, and they can actually ask for an assessment scope explanation meeting within the first 20 days. And then they have 100 days to compile this dossier. So that's a little more than 3 months. So very short, I would say. So you really know that you must be prepared before this happens. And then you submit the dossier and the actual assessment starts. And then it's possible and foreseen that there could be things that are missing. And then the assessors can do a second request for information, to which then the company, the HTD stands for Health Technology Developer, so that's a company. They must respond to this within 15 days if it is a standard procedure. You see this little asterisk here showing that it's actually shorter for certain other procedures. Yes, so then again, the assessment continues, and it's also anticipated that there could arise new questions that were not in the initial request for dossier, and then the company can be asked to answer that too, according to a deadline that is set by the assessors that they choose. Okay, so then hopefully you get your positive opinion and the marketing approval by the European Commission. And around that time, the company will also receive a draft JCA report for review. And you have only 7 days to respond to this. And this review is not to challenge the results or argue your case or anything like that. It's only for a check for factual correctness, and also if there are any commercially sensitive information that should be redacted before it's published. And then finally, if when the updated report is endorsed, it will be published, and that's the end of the procedure. And this must be done no later than 30 days after the marketing authorization. So it's a very fixed timeline. And as you can see, it's very compressed. So both the company and the assessors will have a challenge, I think. And that is, an important message for this part.
Hey, and Sigrid, I do have a question for you, but before I ask you the question, I got notification. Apparently, the chat is not working because this is like the formal webinar format. So I want to change what I just said before. If you have questions, put it in the Q&A because the Q&A should be working. So we will be reviewing the Q&A instead of the chat. So thanks. If you have any questions, just throw it in the Q&A. But my question for you, Sigrid, is is there no letter of intent like with the MAA procedure that you need to, specifically submit for this?
Actually, they have done it a bit joint there, because the EMA letter of intent for the marketing application will now also include a part where you tick a box on whether your product is in scope for the JCA. And if you are in scope and you tick that box, you are also then supposed to contact the HTA secretariat beforehand to get the login to the IT platform where all the communication between the HTA secretariat and the company is done. So they actually piggyback on the EMA letter of intent here. That's how it works. Great. Okay, so this is the timeline. So now we will look at the dossier. So what does the company actually need to submit? And it's quite extensive, and I will show you later the whole scope. But we will start with this, going from a few key principles that we have for this dossier. So firstly, I would say that comprehensiveness is a key feature of the dossier. And you can see that in the rather extensive requirements that you will face. And for example, you will be asked to several times present data of similar kind, but it is just cut in different ways. And so there are 46 different table templates to be used in the dossier, even though perhaps not all of them will be used for every application, but actually I think many, if not most, will be needed. So that gives you one sense of the comprehensiveness. Then the second two principles are clearly stated and repeated in the Implementing Act as well as in the HTA Coordination Group's guidance on the dossier. And the first one is transparency. They want transparency on all types of contextualizing information. So for example, how was the information retrieval done? What were the results? And which studies were excluded and why? For example, and then also any limitations on the available evidence in terms of PICO coverage, quality, bias, etc. And also risk of bias information should be submitted. And you also have to send in any available HTA reports from other geographies on your drug, as well as all the clinical efficacy and safety studies from the EMA application. Whether they address the PICO or not, they just want to see it. They want to have all the data that exists around the drug. The second principle is justification. And this is really important, especially for the first bullet here. If you are not able to address one or several of the requested PICOs, then that must be extremely thoroughly justified. because there is an option according to the regulation for the commission to discontinue the JCA if you're not complete. So you really must justify why that would be okay to not send in a complete dossier. And then other things that need justification are the methods for comparison, any deviations from the methodological guidance, as well as minor things such as data cutoffs in the studies. So a lot of justification must be done. But as you can see on this slide, this is not the actual results we are looking at here. This is just additional contextualizing information. So now we will look at how the PICOs are actually reported. So that's the actual results on relative effectiveness and relative safety. And this is structured based on the population. So you start with one population and go through all the PICOs that apply to that population. And you will then, per study, have to characterize the patient population, how it covers the PICO, any differences between the studies. Then you go to the first PICO, and again, you have to justify the methods, describe the studies in terms of available outcomes, treatment duration, risk of bias information, strength and limitations. And then at the end comes the actual results, the overall survival or whatever. And then there can be additional analysis after that. So that's just one, let's say it's overall survival for this certain comparison. Then you do it again for all the other endpoints that have been requested. And then you go to population 2.
And I think, Sigrid, it is very connected to the way that you would also collect your evidence, so that we will see later. It's a lot of work, and also I think very repetitive. But on the other hand, it comes per building a case per PICO, basically, from A to Z.
Yeah, and it really gives you structure, as you say, on how to generate the evidence. So that it can actually be helpful, I believe, too. Okay, so now next I will just give you a visual on the dossier contents. So these are the 5 different sections and the appendices that are required to be submitted, and all the things under these very shortened. And I will not go through this, but just want to draw your attention to the red arrow that points out where the PICO's results are actually reported. So that's the result. All the rest is this type of contextualizing information that is needed.
And I think, Sigrid, is it okay if I summarize this as, what you need to do is, if you think about the clinical part in MAA, that part with the studies is probably the overlapping part, but then that's typically only 1 or 2 PICOs, and then there is extra work to be done to fulfill all the other parts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the pivotal trials is the common grounds between the regulatory procedure and the HTA procedure. And then, as you said, there are all these other comparisons that will need to be made. Or all, I mean, that can differ depending on the indication, how many different comparators you have, for example. So it could be just a few, but probably more than just the pivotal trial in most cases. Yeah.
I see, Sigrid, that we have a question already in the Q&A, so we can I think address this question here, and if there's anything else coming in, of course, as well. So the question here I have is the information that is required here, is it actually comparable or the same information that is submitted to the national HTA bodies today?
Yes, I think, probably one or several HTA bodies would have requested this information before. I think the big difference is that now you address all the countries in the EU and a couple of more countries at the same time. and also that I believe that they have likely raised the bar a little bit. So now they require, depending on what was the level for the most strict HTA agency before, now they have put that as the baseline for all the HTA assessments. And of course, the timelines that you have to do this earlier than before, instead of taking one of them at a time. Now it's all done up front. And this need for completeness, I think you can, at least that's why how I understand it. It's easy to understand when you see the timeline, because it's very challenging also to the assessors. So they really need to have as much information as possible already from the start, and not have to ask for it, because they don't have any clock stops in this procedure. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The need for having everything to be able to judge from the start. Yeah, and how I look at this, you see that some countries are very much into many comparators and indirect frequency comparisons, so no different evidence. And then you are other countries like Germany, for example, they want to see a whole bunch already of outcomes. And it's like now it's kind of coming together, and the depth of the methodologies connected with all the outcomes. And so I think it's quite a very comprehensive dossier if you just look at the template that has now come available. So yeah, no need to repeat. It's quite some work, and I think there's a lot of work to do up front, that we will be discussing from now onwards, but also during the dossier preparation and during the procedure. It's a phase that it's like peak hour for from a regulatory perspective as well. Peak hour, not peak hour, peak year, in that sense, or years, how you depending on how you look at it. So, and I think there are overlapping parts or efficiencies to be gained, and I think this only works from a timelines and resourcing perspective if you really seek to have all that alignment and efficiencies. I think that's the advice. I think it's important to seek how you can optimize that, and for example, due to our integrated perspective between that regulatory and HTA intersection, we are able to provide these insights on how to optimally approach this. But I think that's going to be key. That's our firm conviction. That's collaboration is very important inside companies.
Yeah, exactly. Inside companies, especially, you can't have different, departments working completely unconnected. You really have to connect between the departments. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, so now let's move to the evidence generation. One of the most common question that we get is, when do we start? When should we start with this? And really, we believe that you should start as soon as possible. Definitely during clinical development, you should be thinking of the HTA evidence generation parallel with the regulatory evidence, because as you saw on the timeline, you have to, at least in the EU, present them at the same time. So, and how is that done? Well, first you have to try to figure out what will be the scope for your assessment. And so you need to do PICO scenarios where you sort of anticipate the assessment scope that you will be given by the assessors later. How to do this? Well, what you do is you look around, see what does the therapeutic landscape look like? Do you have any competitors that are also in development? And how will they likely affect your future PICOs for the JCA? And then you build your evidence generation strategy for that. And also, of course, other input that you can get is from the HTA assessors through a advice procedure. So you can also request the joint scientific consultation at this time.
Highly recommended, I would say.
Yes.
Because it gives you a first pressure test of whether you're...
But still, when you go for the advice or the consultation, you you must have something to present to them. So you can ask them, is this sufficient? We are thinking about these PICOs, are there, and to address them in this way, and then you will get input on your suggestion, but you really have to bring them something. So you still have to start doing the work yourself. And we can look at this a little bit closer. So here are some information sources that you can use when you do these repeated PICO scenarios. So, for example, you will look at treatment guidelines for your target population to look for potential comparators, and also the evidence base for those recommendations. Similarly, it's good to look at other national HTA decisions in similar indications. And again, look for comparators that you could be facing. And also, of course, what evidence did these companies submit and how was that received by the HTA body? This can really inform your own evidence generation and how acceptable it will be. And you might also need to have expert consultations with a clinical expert, especially if you are in a rare disease area or novel area where there are no established treatment guidelines yet. Then again, to find out what is actually used to treat these patients and any important populations or subpopulations. And of course, unmet needs in this area that you could potentially address in your pivotal trial or other trials, or in the indirect treatment comparisons, other evidence generation that you will need. So this is really good opportunity to get good input into your evidence generation.
Yeah, and then you kind of generate some scenarios, probably that ABC will be there, and then you have some others that may come into play, maybe slightly less important or very small subgroups, but you can start anticipating that, and you can then build your evidence plan connected to that. So that's on the next slide. I can talk a little bit about that. So basically, clinical development, very busy working on their phase 2-3 pivotal trials, probably at this stage, thinking about the design for the phase 3. And then you kind of start understanding what PICO will be directly covered by the pivotal trial. And then you think about, okay, what PICOs will not be covered, and what actually do we know about those PICOs? So what information is available? What studies are out there? So literature research, systematic literature researches, or to start targeted, later systematic, but literature searches are really giving you that base. What's out there? What evidence is available? Can we expect? What are the available study results? Can we use them? Can we use them to plot it against our study? And do we need to collect additional real data? Would that be wise to do? And the earlier you start thinking about that, the more you can think about generating the evidence package, and also how that may be even beneficial from a regulatory perspective of later from a how do I get in the clinical treatment guidelines? So it's not just for this, but it's kind of pushes you to consider these things early. And then we will talk about that in the next slide. Indirect treatment comparisons are really important. Yes, let's just jump there.
That's okay.
Sorry.
No, absolutely fine. So indirect treatment comparisons are really going to be very unavoidable. It's not necessarily preferred, direct comparisons is the highest standard, but it's unavoidable and highly acknowledged by the HTA bodies and regulation. So what is actually an ICT? It's a comparison across studies, and I don't want to take a whole lecture here on all the ICT. It can also become pretty technical, but I think if you keep in mind that there's two types actually. You have anchored indirect treatment comparisons across studies and unanchored. And anchored is the ideal situation, or ideal, but where you have you have a randomized controlled trial A versus B, then you have another trial B versus C in terms of, and then your unique comparator can really allow you to bridge the results, right? So you have a possibility to bridge results, relative results, over another comparator that is in both trials.
So that's anchored. But unanchored is when it's not possible. That's quite often the case, actually, when there is nothing, no RCT connected, or even if you have a single arm clinical trial, then nothing of that is possible. And that is also where more advanced adjustments and real data come into play. So, and patient level data come into play. So basically, that is really short, not too much today on that. But what is important to remember is that guidelines on how to do these ITCs are being developed, and also specifically, and the reference is here in light of the EU HTA regulation. So that's very important to consider. And there is many methods available, and typically these methods are driven by data availability. So therefore, it's so important to early understand what data do we have, what data can we get, are we willing to invest or able to invest, and then what methods should we be striving for. The validity of these methods, and it can be different methods per PICO, right? To bear in mind, every PICO is a new situation. And therefore, the validity has to be have to be justified on a case-by-case base. And we anticipate that it's not really preferred by HTA bodies, the unanchored, that's less preferred. But in the case of AT&T in oncology, that's going to be a reality, because there is a lot of challenges in these often rare innovative indications where there's no benchmark available. So yeah, it's going to be an exciting year. Let's say that.
Yeah, and as you say, in these areas, rare indications in oncology, many are approved based on single arm trials. So you don't have an RCT available. So that's why you will likely find yourself
automatically
in a situation where unanchored will be needed.
Absolutely. And when you think about acceptance, so sorry, Sigrid, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that about acceptance. I mean, you must justify it, but I think people or companies should be prepared for quite high, expectations for this. You can't just say we didn't have the data. So then you might get the question, well, why didn't you create the data? So you can't just get away with not having it. You must justify why you couldn't produce it yourself, I believe.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the big difference with the old procedure, right? The old procedure, it was very staggered. So you start working on the file, then you submit to the country. The country says, I don't like this. I want more evidence on ABC. Okay, you say, okay. And then you submit, you delay, but at least you add all these pieces later. There's now, these pieces have to be in from the very beginning. And I think it's going to be hard. I also think it's a good thing, because if you look at the delays will happen in national reimbursement anyways, right? So I think it's good to have it all up front, but it's going to be challenging. And especially for smaller companies, obviously, that typically tended not to think about these things very early.
Yeah, and it can take a lot of resources for small companies as well. So it is a challenge in many ways.
It's planning, yes. So, but I think it's great. Let's go to an example, because to further making a bit more tangible. And I have chosen the example of Pluvicto. And why Pluvicto? Because this actually was a formal example that was done by the UNETA. UNETA helped developing the HTA regulation, and they did some exercises, and Pluvicto was one of them. So it's easier for me because it's it actually happens that member states were able to provide input. So it's then a real world example. So Pluvicto, and I don't want to get into the weeds, but a certain level is helpful in order to understand how it works. So Pluvicto is a treatment that is authorized for the treatment of prostate cancer. And in simplified words, the indication is in patients with progressive PSMA, is a biomarker, positive metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer. They've been previously treated with several treatments, including at least one chemotherapy and some other inhibitors. So heavily pretreated patients.
And the EU approved this treatment based on a randomized controlled trial, solid evidence, demonstrating overall survival benefit versus best supportive care. Best supportive care was the comparator. And if you look at the current treatment guidelines from the ESMO, they do mention that in this particular label population, where this treatment is being placed as per label, we see actually 5 different treatments that are recommended in different subpopulations. So of course we have now already there, which is good, Pluvicto in the patients with the PSMA biomarker. Then we have agemo, carboxytaxel, which is still indicated there, olaparib in patients with BRCA mutations. Then there is also radium-223 in patients with only bone metastasis, so it's a subpopulation again. And then best supportive care is only for those who are unfit for treatment or have exhausted other options, basically. So that's the one that was part of the trial. So if we move to the next slide, you can then see how this simulation, so they ask 8 member states, what would be the PICOs, and then they consolidated that into 6 PICOs. 4 PICOs, PICO 1, 2, 3, 4 are in subpopulations, and PICO 5 and 6 are in the label population. So then the whole population had to be assessed, the whole label population at once. That's the population. So I think, not a surprise if you heard what I just said, is that one population is only bone metastasis. One population is the population that is still actually suited to get another chemotherapy. Another population is the BRCA mutated population, that's PICO 3, because that population has other options as well. And then there is PICO 4, the patients who are entitled to have best supportive care only because they have they're no longer suitable for chemo or other treatments. So that's on a population side. And then of course intervention everywhere. The eye is Pluvicto everywhere. Comparators come really for what is recommended in a label population. So the radium, the carboxytaxel, and PICO 3 is an olaparib for those specific patients, and then best supportive care. And in PICO 5 and 6 is interesting, and you're going to see that a lot actually. They always will request you to investigate the label population, how heterogeneous that population may be. And then there's 2 ways of looking at it. Either it's you kind of pick like a physician choice, so you have a few options that you can choose and then run the analysis by. And then even in PICO 6, it's individualized treatment where you put the right recommended treatment to the right patients, and then you analyze it. So let me not go into the details, but this is something that's expected.
Sorry.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Is the time up? You need to go back. Yes, no worries.
Yeah.
So here you see green and blue, and actually the green ones is where the pivotal trial was able to deliver or inform about, and the blue ones where the pivotal trial was not suited to inform. So PICO 4 is actually the only PICO where you have full information. That information is all available in the clinical trial. Then you see some subpopulations where there is no information on because these patients were excluded from the trial or data was not collected. And then there are some comparators like radium, carboxytaxel, and olaparib. These were purposely excluded from the clinical trial, so there's no information available. If we look at the outcomes, they're all green, which is great, because basically all the outcomes that were requested by the member states were all captured in a trial. That's pretty good. So if we go to the next slide.
But can I just ask you one thing? Looking at this slide here and all these X's, is there anything that the company could have done to design the trial differently to tick more boxes here, do you think? How to think about that?
Yes, and maybe no, but I think it's probably a yes. I think there's a few things. We are mindful, and I think even HTA says there's that for the purpose of regulatory approval, benefit risk, it's important that you are able to get an isolated treatment effect. So to make maybe the trial too heterogeneous and include multiple comparators, that's not always the best solution, right? So, but you could, for example, anticipate several subpopulations and make sure you can do extra analysis. You can really put emphasis making sure all the outcomes are in, and you could consider to think a little bit like, is there a possibility to exclude more comparators? Do I need to be so restrictive? So I think what is really important is to have the visibility, have your scenario ready at the moment you start designing your phase 3, because then at least you can have a lens to it and think, okay, what can I do? And I think this is exactly why as per the HTA regulation, the momentum for joint scientific consultation is actually in the pivotal clinical development stage. So there's kind of an opportunity to look, is there something possible? Could we avoid maybe 1 or 2 extra indirect treatment comparisons by doing it a little bit smarter? Sometimes it will be possible and sometimes not.
Great. Okay.
Well, just to go back to this scope, right? So 6 PICOs, 14 outcomes means 84 different analyses to be captured in that file. We have seen that 14, or for PICO 4 is the only PICO where you can just straight away do your analysis and you have the outcomes. For the rest, you will need to think about how to compile the evidence.
Yeah, and as a former assessor of a regulatory assessor, 14 outcomes from oncology trials sounds a lot. I can think of 4 or 5 efficacy endpoints that we think are really useful. So can you comment on that?
Well, yeah, it's just the relative effectiveness. It's not just relative effectiveness in that sense. It's relative safety as well. The safety outcomes are to be captured, and quality of life. You can count on that. It's going to be part of it because that's very important as well. So it's efficacy. Yeah, you can see here it's a total of 14. Yeah, you have the efficacy ones, and including things like response rates as well, because of course sometimes it's easier to have that indirect comparison versus certain outcomes. So it's a lot. That
explains the many outcomes.
Exactly.
It's both efficacy and safety, or effectiveness, I should say, in this context. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and so what happens with Pluvicto? Well, I don't want to go into all the details, but it is a challenge. It is reimbursed in some countries, but assessments are still ongoing in many countries with challenges with submitting extra data. And of course, it's not just the evidence, right? There's a whole pricing aspect that come into play when national decisions are being made. So let's not go down that route. But what you at least see is that often, and we have scanned some dossiers, often ICTs versus carboxytaxel are provided in the dossiers with mixed acceptability. And I think probably I'm going to repeat myself, so I'll keep it brief. Considering PICOs early helps to be better prepared and have longer time to also maybe with relatively less impact or resources create your evidence package. It allows you to optimize your trial, and not just, we were just talking, Sigrid, about optimizing your trial from a can you do more to hit more PICOs, but there's another thing you can do. You can also optimize your trial in terms of variables that you are collecting or outcomes definitions, etc., to make it more consistent with the data that's out there to allow or facilitate valid indirect treatment comparisons. So there is a lot you can do to kind of put your trial into the best position to make all these analyses possible. And then, of course, real data early, considering how that may be able to help a natural history study, for example. And I think, is this something you just need to do for HTA or to tick box this? I wouldn't suggest to look at it like that. I think real data can support it in many ways, early and later, also from a guideline positioning, treatment use. I think I think there's an early real world evidence strategy is going to be helpful and very important in this as well.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
think we are at the last slides, luckily, because then we can
Yeah.
look at the questions. Quite some questions
Yeah.
are coming in.
So here we just bring back the timeline, and after hearing all this complexity regarding the many different PICOs that could be requested, as well as the comprehensiveness of the dossier, I think it's quite easy to understand that you really need to be prepared before you submit, and you can't create the evidence during this 100-day or even 60-day window. So the dossier must be essentially complete, and hope for that no new PICOs are delivered, but as few as possible, if so. Yeah. So then we can discuss. Do we have any questions?
Sigrid, we have no more slides. Yes, so you can stop sharing.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're having some question in. I think we will probably be able to address them. So, so what if it's not possible to collect the evidence for the PICOs, or if its evidence is poor or lacking here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can start, I guess. Well, if you don't have the data, you can't provide the evidence needed for this PICO. Well, as I said, then you must justify why this was not possible for you to even create yourself this data. And depending on the situation, that will be acceptable or not. But I really think, as I said before, that you should expect the assessors to have quite high expectations here. So you can't just say, we didn't have that. Then you must answer, why didn't you have it? Is it reasonable that you didn't do those extra efforts to get that data? So yeah, for sure.
And then yeah, that's a very valid point. And if the pivotal trial is already ongoing, I mean, that's the next question. What is it if it's already ongoing? And it will, I mean, to be honest, we face that often, right? That we come in when at least the pivotal trial is considered to be locked, and actually the EMA scientific advice was just came in. So, there's no opportunity there, but I still think, and Speedy, you just do your PICO exercise. You're a little bit later down the road, so you have probably a pretty good visibility on the PICO, or you can at least get that by talking to experts as well. And of course, then just what's not going to be there in the pivotal trial, and you just connect everything. It's just you generate your evidence strategy and plan given your situation, and you go fast forward. So I think that's just what it's just optimal to do it before, and to have and to consider the pivotal trial. But otherwise, it's just fast forward depending on where you are. And let's see, there's another question I can address. So another question is around the supportive care and treatment of physician children seem highly overlapping and vulnerable to national preferences. How much should this national practice variation be expected? I'm just really, and it's a very fair question, and I'm curious to see. I think that the consolidation process of the PICO consolidation is going to be important, right? And also even with the PICO exercise, the Pluvicto PICO exercise, they have learned from that also that consolidation is going to be important, and it is going to be important to not create massive number of PICOs, because it's not only for the
company
product developers, but they will need to assess all of that,
exactly.
right? So I expect that hopefully it will stay relatively simple and on the without too much overlapping. And if it's really overlapping, then you can even say, well, sorry, this is the justification why we refer to that analysis. Or I really think it's yeah, I'm curious to see what in the end the PICOs are like, and I hope that it will look simpler than what you come with in your assessments.
Yeah, there are a couple of more questions now. One is there a rapporteur role or completely the independent national request? And yeah, we were not very clear about this, but and I said HTA assessors, and actually that's the name of the rapporteurs in this system. So assessor and co-assessor. It's a similar system as the regulatory EU procedure where you have the rapporteur and the co-rapporteur. Here it is called the assessor and the co-assessor, and they are representing different member states. So they will, make a suggestion similar to the EMA procedure. They will make a suggestion, and then they will discuss with the member states what PICOs they need, and then they will come up with a consolidated PICO scope for the developer. So yes, there is a rapporteur role. There are 2 countries that are collaborating to write the report. And then we have...
And then, I can address that one.
Yeah.
We have another question around not understood why PICOs not related to the targeted population of the label should be evaluated. In fact, all PICOs that were presented actually do relate to the target population, because you're absolutely right that it makes no sense if the PICOs are not related to the targeted population. But the targeted population starts with the label population. And what you see is, for example, when I said the subpopulation on patients with bone metastasis, it's a smaller subgroup of the overall targeted population, because in that group, they also could have the biomarker, and they would also be eligible to receive Pluvicto, but also to receive radium therapy, radium-223. So in that sense, so all and even in the BRCA mutated ones, I mean, not sure how frequent it is and how applicable, but you can imagine that part of the biomarker population may also have a BRCA mutation. The relevance to that, not fully understood myself, but in the general principle is the label indication is the starting point, and that is hence it's the label, so also the targeted population. What you see with Pluvicto is that actually it is shifting, I think, from a national reimbursement perspective to a later line of treatments. And then, of course, if it's the last resort treatment, then indeed it becomes maybe only best supportive care, right? But the thing is that that's not the label population here. So I think key lesson learned maybe is to think also carefully about this when you set your label in a population. That's another interactivities. Yeah. The label you are requesting from an EMA perspective will directly impact the number of PICOs and the requested analysis. So that's how they are related.
Yeah, and I can also add to that, apart from subpopulations within the target populations, subpopulations that have a different potential comparator are of interest. But in addition to that, also the HTA bodies, if you have a very expected to be pricey drug, they might consider restricted reimbursement indications. So they could by themselves want to restrict it to second line treatment within that population or something like that. That is not your primary analysis, but you have a subgroup that you can look at. So that is also something that the HTA bodies could ask for, potential restricted reimbursement populations that are subgroups of the target population.
Well, so and in that case, I do think that if you have your entire file and then you have your label population and that PICO, but then you have a subpopulation and then you address that PICO very well, and that's actually the population that is of your real interest from a reimbursement perspective, then I do believe that the national body will look at that massive dossier and directly go to that part. Okay, but this is where I see for my country this treatment being positioned, what do I think about evidence in that situation? And then they can use that to judge upon the validity of that analysis, and not necessarily about the whole, because not everything will be relevant for every country ultimately.
No, for sure not, depending on the treatment landscape and the finances of the country.
I think we have a very interesting last question.
Yep. So currently, often early advice from the GBA, as German HTA body, is done to get input for the pivotal trial. How do you see that now in the context of the JCA? Well, the GBA will be part of this joint clinical assessment. So when you go for a joint scientific consultation, you will automatically, you should get the input from the GBA as well. But then, of course, countries might prioritize or deprioritize how much they take part in the joint scientific consultation. So, but I think the GBA will be very active. But perhaps you should ask them.
but to convert it the other way around, will national advice still be possible? Now we have the JCA, right? Because I think that's another thing that I think it's the procedure. The joint scientific consultation is meant to be the leading procedure. You're not supposed to go to individual HTA bodies for information around PICOs or evidence. However, this is just relative effectiveness, right? So there's also still what do you need to do from a health economic perspective, etc. So I think the national HTA procedures for advice will still be possible and applicable, and it's difficult for us to fully understand or to what extent you will still be able to just make use of national advice and in addition to, or whether there is some, restrictive rules on how you can navigate this, and also at what stage of development.
Yeah.
So on top of that, but
somehow I would hope that the national agencies, prioritize contributing to the joint assessment, because that would be most helpful to the countries, to the developers. So I hope that, and that could lead to deprioritization of national advice, I believe, because it's a resource thing, and this will take more resources from this whole regulation will require more resources from the national HTA bodies.
So, but Sigrid, I think this is a great bridge, because we're nearly on top of the hour, but actually we do plan to have another webinar very focused around joint scientific consultation. I don't know exactly when that will be, but keep an eye on that. But I think, how to get your advice in, that's going to be really important. And also, what are the different avenues and there and when. So, we hope this was informative. Don't hesitate to provide your feedback and things for improvement. Just reach out to us in case of any pending question.